In this section of our Unit 2, the world of the Old Testament, we're going to focus upon different people groups that were in the land. There's a very interesting statement there in Genesis chapter 12 as Abram begins his journey into the land which God has called him. As he comes into, for example, the first site that we mentioned is the city of Shechem. And in that context, which is centrally located and will become an important site throughout the rest of biblical history of the Old Testament, even shows up in the New Testament, John chapter 4. The woman at the well is from Sychar, which is what we would call today a suburb of the city of Neapolis, which was the New Testament name of ancient Shechem. So it's very fascinating that we have the connection between Old Testament and New Testament in the area of ancient Shechem. It's also one of the first places that Jacob comes to when he comes back into the land after spending those years with Uncle Laban and gaining a couple wives and a couple concubines and 12 sons and daughters out of that world of Upper Mesopotamia, again, which is the land of the Arameans, from which, again, God calls Abram and Sarai after the death of Terah, the father of Abraham, and they begin their journey into the land of Canaan. But it's also very interesting that you have the phraseology that it's almost like a parenthesis that it says, now the Canaanites were in the land. And that's interesting because that's actually a historical statement, because we understand this land was becoming known as the land of the Canaanites during the Middle Bronze era. The early Bronze era was when all of these people groups begin to converge and move through this land and set up, you might call villages and towns in the early Bronze Age that we talked about briefly before in this larger section. But in the context, we have, again, as I mentioned earlier, the references to numerous people groups that had become a part of the land, no doubt from the early Bronze Age or perhaps even before, as they migrated through this, what we call bridge between Egypt in the southwest, Anatolia and the Hittites to the north, Syria, Babylonia, Akkad, and Sumer of Mesopotamia, that this was really the crossroads of international trade throughout ancient times, really as we know today, dating all the way back into the Neolithic period. That 1,000 years or more before Abraham, people were transmigrating across this region, and recent studies have shown that there are relationships between, in the Neolithic period, coastal Spain with the Indus River Valley in the Far East. People have been transmigrating through this area throughout ancient times. And so this becoming the land of the Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, as it describes in Genesis 15, going on the Rephaim and the Amorites and Canaanites. And one of the things that we'll also look at is how some of these terms are used. Like sometimes, again, it refers to the people of the land of Abraham's being called to as simply the Canaanites. Canaanites were in the land. But in other texts, of course, we have, like in Genesis 15, all of the subgroups. So sometimes the terminology of Canaanite can be a collective term, and other times it is a particular people group, as described back in the descendants of Noah, back in the earlier chapters in Genesis 6 through 9. So these various people groups that then spread out in Genesis 10, the table of the nations, as it's described, become part of, again, the broader world of ancient Near East. So we'll look at, again, the uses of these. Similarly, the terms of Amorite can be both broad and narrow in focus. So sometimes it's on the narrow, the ethnic people of the Amorites, and other times it's referred to the people who live across the upper Mesopotamian region. They're also at other times called the land of the Arameans, from which God called Abram. So you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 26 and verse 5. My forefather was a wandering Aramean who went down to Egypt, describing the migration of Abram down to Egypt as described in Genesis chapter 12. So we'll look at the variety of people groups of the ancient world.